Jackson Carter had always been the quiet one in class. Not because he was shy, but because he had learned early on that some teachers saw only what they wanted to see. And in Mrs. Henderson's 6th grade history class, he was invisible. For months, she never called on him, even when his hand was raised. When he answered correctly, she moved on quickly. When he made a mistake, which was rare, she lingered, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of it to settle over him. His classmates noticed, too. "Dude, she never looks at you," his friend Marcus whispered one afternoon. "You got teacher invisibility or something?" Jackson had only shrugged. "Guess so." But today, something was different. Mrs. Henderson kept glancing his way, not with annoyance or dismissal, but with something else. Anticipation. The lesson was on the Civil War, something about General Sherman's march. Jackson listened, took notes, and waited for the usual routine. But then it happened. "Jackson," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice cutting through the hum of the classroom. "Why don't you answer this one?" Heads turned. Jackson blinked. She never called on him. He sat up straighter. Sherman's march to the sea was a military campaign aimed at breaking the Confederacy's resources and morale. She pursed her lips. Not bad. A few students exchanged looks. Marcus shot him a glance that said, "What was that about?" As the class went on, Jackson felt her eyes on him more than before. And just before the bell rang, she made her move. "Jackson, stay behind for a moment." A few students murmured as they packed up. Jackson took his time putting his notebook away before approaching her desk. "I overheard you talking the other day," she said, folding her hands neatly. "About your grandfather." Jackson frowned. "What about him?" "You said he was a musician." He hesitated. "Yeah, he was a pianist. Played jazz." Mrs. Henderson's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Interesting. You must have picked up a thing or two." Jackson didn't like where this was going. "A little." Her eyes gleamed. "Good to know." Then she gestured toward the dusty upright piano in the corner of the room. "Tomorrow, let's see what you've got." The weight in the room shifted. A few students paused near the doorway, listening. Jackson narrowed his eyes. "Why?" "Why not?" she replied smoothly. "You said your grandfather played. I'm sure you have some of that talent in you." He knew that tone. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't encouragement. It was a setup. Jackson barely slept that night. He lay in bed, replaying the conversation, feeling the challenge underneath her words. She expected him to fail, to embarrass himself, to prove whatever opinion she had already formed about him. But she didn't know the full story. The next morning, whispers followed Jackson into the classroom. "You gonna play today?" A boy named Ethan smirked. Jackson ignored him. "Didn't know you were a piano guy," Marcus murmured. "There's a lot people don't know." Mrs. Henderson entered, her usual air of control wrapped around her like a shield. She barely looked at him during the lesson, but he could feel it coming. And then, "Well," she said, closing her book, glancing at the clock. "We have some time before the next lesson." "Perfect. Jackson, let's see what you can do." The energy in the room changed. Students turned in their seats. Some whispered, some smirked. Jackson exhaled slowly, stood up, and walked to the piano. A few muffled laughs rippled through the room. He ignored them. He ran his fingers lightly over the keys. They were old, slightly yellowed, some chipped at the edges. The piano was out of tune, not by much, but enough. He took a breath, sat down, and placed his hands on the keys. Then, someone snickered behind him. It wasn't just about proving Mrs. Henderson wrong anymore. It was about proving everyone wrong. And he would do it in a way they'd never forget. He pressed the first notes. A blues progression. Smooth, steady. The kind his grandfather used to play on slow Sunday afternoons. His fingers moved with confidence. Left hand keeping time, right hand weaving melody. The classroom shifted. The whispers stopped. The smirks faded. Even Mrs. Henderson's expression changed, her arms crossing, her brow furrowing slightly. She had expected hesitation, maybe a clumsy attempt. But instead, she was hearing something she hadn't prepared for. Jackson didn't stop to look at her. He wasn't playing for her. He was playing for himself. He sank into the music, his fingers gliding effortlessly, striking the perfect balance between technique and raw feeling. Then, he took a risk, an intricate run up and down the keyboard. A progression his grandfather had taught him. One he had struggled with for months before finally mastering. The weight of the silence in the room was different now. Not awkward. Not expectant. It was reverent. When he reached the crescendo, the sound swelled, filling every inch of the space where doubt had once lived. And then, silence. The last note lingered before fading. For a moment, nobody moved. And a single clap. Then another. And another. The entire class was applauding. Marcus let out a low whistle. Damn! Ethan, arms crossed, shook his head slightly. Didn't know he could do that. Jackson exhaled, his heart steady. He had done more than play. He had changed something. But the loudest silence came from Mrs. Henderson. She stood still, arms crossed, lips pressed together. The applause surrounded her, but she hadn't moved. Finally, she spoke. That was unexpected. The clapping died down, but students still whispered, eyes flicking between her and Jackson. Where did you learn to play like that? She asked. Jackson met her gaze. My grandfather. Something flickered in her expression, too quick to name. Then, she straightened. I see. A pause. A long one. Then she turned to the class. Let's move on. But no one moved right away. The energy had shifted. They had seen something they weren't supposed to ignore. That's it. Ethan muttered. You make a big deal out of it, and now you're just gonna move on? Mrs. Henderson's mouth tightened. This is a classroom, not a talent show. Jackson exhaled. You didn't think I could play, did you? Her eyes snapped to his. That's why you asked me. A ripple went through the room. Mrs. Henderson's grip on her book tightened. That's enough, Jackson. But he wasn't done. You wouldn't have asked Marcus. Or Ethan. But you asked me. Why? For the first time all year, Jackson didn't immediately obey. And Mrs. Henderson, who always controlled the room, looked just a little bit shaken. Jackson walked back to his seat. The silence stretched. He wasn't nervous. If anything, he felt calm. Marcus nudged him. Dude, you just flipped everything upside down. Jackson smiled. Yeah, I think I did.